Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. Today, we're going to dive into the mantic arts and divination, my old stomping grounds. Actually, I should say my current stomping grounds. But specifically today, we're going to have a chat about tarot cards and how to enjoy and benefit from them. Now, I've been the host of Pathways now for over 30 years. And in the interest of full disclosure, for those listeners who don't know this about me, I was an I Ching author who invented the category of software, which I called divination software, by producing the first software version of the Chinese I Ching, which is a divination system. And that was back in 1989. And after that, I produced, with the help of a tarot scholar, we produced a tarot CD-ROM, and then I became the founder of Tarot.com and iching.com, and ultimately AOL Horoscopes. I wasn't the founder of AOL Horoscopes, but we drove AOL Horoscopes, the company did. So I have a lot of experience in this realm, but we haven't had anybody on the air in so long to talk about divination other than me. And so I want to introduce our guest today is Jaymi Elford. She's a Portlander and the author of the new book, the relatively new book, Tarot Inspired Life. Use the cards to enhance your life. Now, Jaymi lives a tarot-inspired life, and reading her book makes that very obvious. She uses the cards as a tool to explore the world we live in and create meaning. She's an accomplished reader and a respected member of the international tarot community. She has taught at Reader's Studio, the Bay Area Tarot Symposium, and Northwest Tarot Symposium. Lo Scarabeo published her first deck, Triple Goddess Tarot, in 2017. And I love Lo Scarabeo. We used to have some of their decks on Tarot.com, and they have some of the sexiest decks I've ever seen. She is also the co-host of Card Slingers Coast to Coast. Hello, Jaymi, and welcome to the Pathways Show.
Hello, Paulo. Well, thank you for having me. What a warm welcome. And it's always fun to hear the history behind, the people that are interviewing me, where I still kind of play around with Tarot.com, and I remember the I Ching sites, and I may have actually owned your disc back in the early 90s.
Yeah, that's what you were saying before. And I want to encourage you to own our app of the I Ching, the Visionary I Ching app, which is I run a nonprofit now, which is the Divination Foundation. So it's all about divination and how to make better decisions. And my whole focus has always been the mantic arts as applied to intuitive decision making. But there's so many other ways that you can use it. And your book is a kind of a really beautiful array of different ways to benefit from, or just have fun, using one of these classical divination systems, tarot cards. So tell us, when did you first discover tarot?
Well, I've been a lifelong reader, and I started reading adult books when I was in third grade. However, about the time I turned 13, I stumbled across, I think it was either Walden Books or B. Dalton back in kind of the mid 80s, their metaphysical section. And I had loved card games, and I found these tarot cards, these decks with these books. And I was just like, what are these things? They look interesting. And so I grabbed a copy of US Games Tarot of the Witches when I was able to afford enough money to buy one. And I started playing with them, read the little booklet, saw all those keywords, got instantly overwhelmed with it. And I would try and do Celtic cross readings. And back then we didn't have cell phones. So I would actually take pictures. I would literally try and get my camera, at the right height, take pictures of the spreads, and then eventually have those develop. And I never did anything back then, but today with cell phones and everything, I'm always telling my clients or students or anybody to take the pictures of the readings that I give them for later study, because it's a perfect journaling tool for you. So back then I was kind of doing it, but didn't really expand into that realm.
You mentioned that journaling aspect, because that was one of the features that I built into Tarot.com that I was really proud of, the fact that it would save all your readings. And then we invented some algorithms that would go there and search through all the readings you might have ever gotten and tell you what card came up most often, what suit came up most often, which it was really, really awesome. But
And I love computers and technology and the internet to be able to do that, because it gives you that examination, that long-term examining of the habits and patterns. And then you can use that for future studies and kind of forecasting, or just seeing the repetitions of your patterns in life.
well, people always used to give me, especially some traditional people from the Tarot community, say, "Oh, how can you let a computer get in the middle of this? What about the energy? What about the, the relationship between the reader and the client?" And I said, "Oh yeah, no question. There's nothing better than a reading from a gifted reader, but it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you $100 and or more, and who knows if he or she's having a good day, or how gifted they are in the first place. There's a lot of people that just make stuff up. I've been on these psychic hotlines before just to test them out, because they all wanted to advertise on Tarot.com. And so
Yeah.
I say, and so I find the one who had all these high rating as a tarot reader, and so I say, okay, I want a tarot reading. And so then she'd start talking about something or other. I said, well, what card did I get? She goes, card? Card, what do you mean? I said, no, which tarot card is involved here? I want a tarot reading. She'd say, oh, something. She'd say the jack of the world, or just some nonsensical thing. And I realized,
Yeah.
this person knows nothing about the tarot set of archetypes. But okay, so no, we're talking with you, and you are a real human being. And there's, like I said, there's no substitute for a gifted reader who's there with you and your energy. I mean, our readings on tarot.com were $5, but it's a different situation. And so we were limited to the very classical definitions of the cards and the positions in the spread, based on numerology, based on correspondences of all types. But we try to keep it independent of subjective feelings or viewpoints of a reader. So
yeah,
when using tarot for yourself and reading for others is different. How long have you been reading cards?
Well, like I said, I kind of played around with the cards in junior high and stuff. And back then they were telling us to memorize stuff. And I went, I can't do this. So I left tarot for a while, went to I Ching with the Wilhelm system, casted, the coins just for myself. Right. Asking about boyfriends and love is really interesting when you're using that interpretation that's made for emperors and empresses and different dynasties.
We're a heavily patriarchal society.
Yeah, it was, again, that taught me kind of synthesis, but I had one script to read from rather than all the different meanings. I went back to reading in high school, where I found the Handel deck and Rachel Pollett's fantastic 2-book set on how to use those cards and interpret the meanings with the images. So I started kind of reading for myself probably around 16, 17, and then professionally doing it for others around 2000. However, in the college days, the intervening years, I was reading for friends, but to me, that's kind of the setup before I started charging money for my readings.
Okay, so your most famous deck is probably the Triple Goddess Tarot. So why was it called the Triple Goddess Tarot, and how did that happen?
So back in 2017, I had been a staff writer, I think, for 2 years for Los Garabeo. The first deck I did was the Lema Tarot with Renata Lechner. And it's not a Thoth-focused deck. It's not a Golden Dawn. It was called what it was called because that's the world that she kind of created. So the first thing I had to do was distinguish that. So like I said, I was right. I think I did 4 or 5 different booklets or world buildings for those decks that Los Garabeo had me do. And then they were like, we want you to do the Triple Goddess Tarot. And I felt like I was dropped into the deep end because I have always wanted to design a deck, but this was my first actual shot with being kind of the director, coming up with the images and then telling an artist, a professional artist, to, here, do this and do all the stage design and stuff. So it took me about 6 months, amazingly, to figure out what that Triple Goddess concept was, who are those ladies? What stories would they want to tell in a tarot setting that may have not already been done? Because again, there's multiple decks out there on many different subjects or many different themes. And one night as I was falling asleep, they came and they told me their story through the major arcana. So I wrote down all the notes that I had for that story. And then the next day I started developing the images or adding to the images that were already kind of coming into my mind. And then I worked with Franco Ravelli, who has done a lot of other Lo Scarabeo decks as well. And he and I started creating the world for the triple goddesses to play in, which in my mind, I wanted more of an urban fantasy kind of set, because for me as a fiction writer, that's the world I like to live in, where we have like Portland today, except you might see gargoyles walking around or fire spinners.
I have seen some gargoyles lately.
True. Yeah. The gargoyle car is still around. I've seen it on the
East
streets and I'm
Portland
so
Park.
excited. Yeah. Yeah. So we've got all this cool stuff. And I tried to blend that into this deck with a little bit of romanticism and stuff. It is predominantly femme presenting focused, because that's kind of how the deck wanted. And I have some people would say it's a really harsh emperor card, but I wanted at least that one masculine card that could kind of bounter or counterbalance in a way the rest of that feminine energy. And I know that there are two different types of, like, when you pair the Empress and the Emperor together, there's kind of like two generic binary thinkings around it, that they're complements to one another, where the Emperor is the consort to the Empress, or vice versa, depending on what your worldview is, or that they are the opposites of the same coin, where one is more soft and giving and the other one's more strict and boundary rules. So I know Ricardo and I kind of went around the circle, on that card, because he saw them as the partners. And I'm like, in this deck, I want them to be opposites of each other, where I look at a lot of decks these days as being a whole person, with each card, all the 78 cards, as aspects of a whole body.
That's interesting. Okay. So why did you decide to write a book, The Tarot Inspired Life?
I've always been a writer. Growing up, I was always writing stories. I was always creating worlds. In college, I was going to be a creative writing major. And then I moved up here into Portland from Colorado and cut my teeth on tech writing and professional writing. And I always thought that I'd probably be a poet, but then I found sudden fiction, like really short stories, basically almost like you capture a story within like the cards, so to speak. Tarot by that point had kind of been a tool and something I really enjoyed using. And I started playing around with the idea of writing fiction through the National Novel Writing programs. That came out about 2001, 2002. And most listeners to this will probably recognize that as NaNoWriMo, where it's a self-competition, but it has the ability to bring writers together. So it's not, writing is kind of a solitary thing. We sit here on our desk, we type, and then we hope and pray that somebody somewhere is going to, get us published somewhere, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And Nano says, take those computers or take your typewriters to a coffee house. If you have questions, ask people. And in 2011, I wrote the first draft of Tarot Inspired Life as a 50,000 word thing. I didn't know how much it was going to, impact my life. And then I, started re-editing it, revisioning it, talking to my friends that were at Llewellyn, that were at Weiser, different places, to figure out information on targeting. And then I sent the proposal out at the beginning of 2016, or sorry, 2018.
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to live a tarot inspired life?
To me, to live a tarot inspired life is to build a life around the cards as your companion. Tarot taught me how to sew. Like behind me here, I've got a lot of decks that have nice little clothes to carry them in, or bags like these little baggies here. And so designing stuff for decks. It taught me how to crochet. It taught me how to bring the cards into almost every aspect of my life, as a companion, as a mentor, mentee, as a cheerleader, where back in the day, in the 90s, a lot of people were telling me, oh, you can only use tarot for others. You can't read for yourself. And if you read for yourself, you can only ask the question once, and then you have to put it away. And with the variety of decks out there, and the fact that I really glommed onto the cards, it's like I didn't want to do just one reading a day. I wanted to see what else I can do with them. And so my love of writing fiction and then writing and playing with the cards came into play, where I started literally using the cards to build my worlds, build my characters. There are spreads out there that you can find. For the book, I created my own. And again, I tested and I played with these things, where tarot began as a game. And sometimes I feel like we've forgotten that tarot and learning tarot is a playful, joyful activity.
Well, your book really brings that out. Your book makes that
Thank you.
so amply and in so many ways. It's really beautiful. I want to ask you a couple questions that I've wondered about for years. And you may not be an expert on the answer to this, but the Crowley Deck. I never liked the idea of naming a card one word, like despair or something like that. It would seem like that's way too didactic and awfully negative in many cases. Like the devil card, or the death card. It's sort of like it implies. I mean, rebirth is the other side of it. If you want to look at the archetypes in their fullness. So, what do you make of? Do you agree with me, or that seems like it just lends such a bias to every card that's got one of those words on it.
I do. I agree. I mean, having done readings for different clients or even in event settings, when I use kind of a Crowley or even a Smith Rider Waite deck where it's got, keywords on it, everybody gloms onto those. And I'm like, don't, because your question has a story behind it, or the tarot has to answer that question. And if you get despair on a card and that's not what I'm seeing in the card, that's kind of that misnomer. You get that disconnect, because to me, especially in my private practice, when I read the cards, well, your bias, your life, your whatever, like you said earlier, this episode, whatever's going on in your life is going to influence how you see that card. So you might get a really joyful card like the 3 of Cups, where they're dancing and partying, and you're going to be like, my ex left me. And I go with that rather than that joyful, like, communal connection, right? Because there's something going on. Even if it's not going to answer the question directly, I always go with what my client wants, because what they're saying, because that's where the heart of the matter is. When these images kind of conjure up, like you said, the archetypes, they conjure up what's going on in their life. And sometimes you have to set aside the question or set aside the traditional meanings to be able to get to what is going on in your life. Why do you see this joyful card as something that might be negative?
I wrote a book called Divination, and I had a definition of divination, that of a divination system is a way to stimulate your intuition to think outside the box around a problem or issue that logic can't handle. And so that was my way of saying, well, if logic can handle it, that's good enough. If logic tells you get a vaccine, then get a vaccine. It's not an intuitive decision because it's based on science. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. So, but that sort of, you reminded me of that whole idea that, you let the cards or the I Ching hexagram evoke something from within you, to resonate with something that rings true for you, and then you derive the meaning from that event.
Yes. And, while we do, we have meanings, we have the archetypes in every card as that starting point, especially for teaching. You have to have like, in order to learn to read English, you need to know the alphabet, A, B, C, D, etc. So in learning the language of tarot, we look at the archetypes, we look at those connections, those archetypes that are so worldwide that everybody can kind of glom onto them. Where, you know, the Empress is kind of a mother figure in tarot, at least in the binary system we have. It's still a starting point because most of us that are born, we have mothers, or we have somebody that comes in and becomes that mother figure, whether they're feminine facing or masculine facing. So it's able to, when we pick up that card again, we can, you know, have that springboard to say, oh, this card kind of has this associations. But, you know, to one person, mother might be a extremely close-knit connection to where you go into business with one another in the future. Others might say, well, my mother, well, we got issues there. And so, you know, with that, you get that different dialogue, and then you get to play around with, well, how can I make this card either positive or negative? Even though I don't really like saying positive and negative terms anymore, because we have the full life of experience in everybody. We just use those cards as the conversation starters that, you know, teach us the different lessons or the different outcomes that we want to bring into our life or push away from us.
You know, when you talk about, you mentioned archetypes, and we could mention correspondences. Every
Yep.
card has got a numerological value. And, you know, and this is, but in your book, you actually encourage people to find a deck that you like that's
Mhm.
got graphics on every card, not just the pips.
Yeah.
And so this brings up a question that's related to some skepticism I have about art-driven tarot decks, and you're the perfect person to ask because you made one, the Triple Goddess Tarot. Why should I assume? I mean, okay, take Rider Waite, Pamela. Who was the artist on that?
Pamela Coleman Smith.
Pamela Coleman Smith, right? So why should we assume that Pamela Coleman Smith had a like special sense or intuitive, special intuitive sense about the correspondences of each card, such that she could come up with a graphic that was truly archetypal? Whereas there's all kinds of people making tarot decks now that I don't think they're particular. I don't guess that they're necessarily enlightened just because they're inspired by, they like tarot and they want to do this project.
Yeah, I think there are two things going on. I know that my friend Benabel Wen, who wrote Holistic Tarot, has kind of stumbled on this. She has a blog post up on her site, and I'll give you that information for your show notes later. She's talking about how tarot can be seen as highbrow art, so to speak, or high art and low art, where high art is kind of where we see things in museums, like your Rembrandts or your Salvador Dali. And I mentioned Dali because he did a deck. And then you have your low art, which most people are probably associating with tarot, where, like you said, anybody can make a deck, but it's usable. It's on paper. It's not going to be around for a while. It might be limited. It might be cheap, even though some decks are not cheap, especially the ones that you get like hand painted. You know, you can spend a lot of money collecting tarot for its art.
Sure.
And for me, I think it depends on who is using it or what the purpose is. I have friends in the community that only collect tarot. They may know how to read it. I mean, they know about the structure, but they might be just collectors because they love the art and the portability of the art. And then there's others like me who are like, oh, I want to do it all in tarot. I want to write books. I want to design decks, that I can't illustrate. I mean, I draw a pretty basic stick figure and some cartoon cat type stuff, but there is that use for me. And it's one of those things where sometimes an intuitive hit, or sometimes you, like with the Triple Goddess, it was created for a purpose, for a gap in like deck collectors or for a use.
Right. Now, we don't have much time, but I do want to bring up an aspect that you spend a lot of time on in the book, and happily so, and that's the story-driven approach to tarot and the whole story of the Fool's Journey, which is sort of like the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell. And that's a really awesome story through the 22 of the major arcana. It's really quite a mythic storytelling device. And you encourage people to write their own Fool's Journey because it helps you build your own mythology. with the help of your tarot deck. Now, that's just one of the many interesting and creative ideas that you have in this book. But if you want to take a minute and speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I wrote Tarot Inspired Life as a series of experiments where these were things that I have done in my life between 2000 and about 2010. I started teaching around 2007. So some of the experiments in the book became actual classes at conferences. And again, it all revolved around what can I do with tarot? How can I integrate it in my life? So that whole idea of the hero's journey or the fool's journey, all the different stories are in it. To me, it personalizes the deck. It makes it your own. And again, learning in the earlier years, in the 80s and the 90s, it always felt like I had to disavow my own intuition and go with like what Mary Kay Greer said or Rachel Pollack. I was always grabbing other people's books. And I'm trying in my book, especially in the early chapters, where I teach you how to create your own meanings, for how to create a symbol dictionary, because everything on the card, from the colors to even like clothes, can be a symbol. That can be something you glom onto to remind you, oh, when I look at the fool, they're barefoot. Oh, well, that's kind of dumb or foolish or silly, and that can become an interpretation for you to figure that out. So it's just a bunch of experiments that you can do to integrate tarot into many different aspects of your life and as springboards for you to create more.
Well, on that note, we have run out of time. There's so much more we could explore. The show is too damn short. Thank you so much for being here. I mean, we could talk about using tarot as a meditation aid or invocations, aka spells, and that's all in the book. I want to encourage people to take a look at your book, The Tarot Inspired Life, and at your website too, which is www.innercompasstarot.com. It's all one word, innercompasstarot.com. And for those who may have tuned into Pathways late, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, author of the book Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. And don't worry, you can play or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with Jaymi Elford, author of The Tarot Inspired Life. And I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every other Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific time. And even better, podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com, spelled DIVI nation.com, on YouTube, and as well as iTunes and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Jaymi Elford and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.